everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's me, Jackie.
And it's me, Diane. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Do you like how Diana left a little pause because she wasn't sure if I was done my song yet? I knew that's what it was.
The song just keeps going. Fun times. Fun times. Uh-oh. But, you know, I've been thinking a lot lately. Expressions, various expressions.
So gross.
What? What's so gross?
I've been thinking about expressions during the night.
Oh, no. See, now you've gone too far.
Too far.
I was thinking of classic expressions like when you gotta go. You gotta go.
Oh, I was
Where are you
thinking
going, though? It could be a lot of different places. But if you read the title of the podcast in your podcast player,
you probably know where this is going.
Where we are going on this. But it's not a podcast about metaphorical going or metaphysical going. No, it's a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. And every week we pick a topic and discuss some relevant research articles. And this week we have a revisited topic. And with a revisited topic, we have a special guest to take us on this trip. So we are going to be talking about toilet training and revisiting the topic of toilet training, which we've not talked about in a long time. But fortunately, we have someone who wrote an article so thorough that anything that was not visited originally will have been definitively revisited by the end of our time together. And that is special guest, Dr. Maeve Donnelly. Maeve, thank you for coming on the show.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be here. I'm a big fan, and I remember when you did your first toilet training episode, and I'm just really, really thrilled to be here while you revisit this topic today.
Yes. We are very excited to have you. Thanks for sticking with us through all those episodes to come back to like a super important topic. I cannot believe we haven't talked about this since episode 8. Spoiler alert for the pairings part of this show. It's been super long, and it's a topic that people have written into us multiple times, actually, to have us talk about or to ask questions about. So I'm so glad that we now have an expert to help us wade through this topic. I did not mean to say that.
I think you did. I think it was purposeful. Well, I think it's probably because we did that episode and there was nothing to talk about for all those years. And then Maeve's article's out. So it's like, no, look at all these things to talk about, all the questions unanswered. So today answered, or like most of them, probably not all of them, because we don't have, we're not going to read the article in its entirety. We're just going to hit the big strokes. But you should.
Listeners at home.
Yes. If you do anything related to supporting individuals with toilet training, this is like, but what if it goes wrong? No, read this. You should be okay. You should be okay. Maybe not, because there's still always something really weird that could go wrong, but I'd be shocked. All right. So, Diana, what articles are we going to be discussing today?
Oh no, I'm somehow unprepared for this. We have 2 articles to talk about today. And they are an extension of commonly used toilet training procedures to children with autism spectrum disorder by Perez, Bacati, Peters, and Vollmer. That was published in JABA 2020. And Resolving Barriers to Continence for Children with Disabilities, Steps Toward Evidence-Based Practice by Donnelly and Karsten. That was published in Behavior Analysis and Practice 2024. Hot off the press.
Wow. Oof. Okay.
And that will keep us busy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's plenty.
2 articles is good.
That is a lot. That
episode. There is much to discuss.
I'm going to be honest, Maeve, reading your article and Dr. Karsten, co-author's article, it definitely was like, but what if this? No, don't worry. This is what you'll do. Yeah, but what if you know what? Here's a summary of something else that should probably. It had that great feel of like, no matter what kind of idiosyncratic question I could think of, like, yeah, but sometimes I feel like it doesn't work because here are some solutions. Yeah, there always was an answer. I don't know if that's how, we'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. I don't know if that's how you plan to write it. You're like, what is everyone going to email me when I write this thing? Yeah, but you missed it. I better, no one can email me. Got it all.
Very much there's an app for that episode.
But before we dig into that, we'd love it to hear a little bit more about yourself and how you came to be working on this amazing topic, amazing article.
Well, thank you for the compliment about the article. I appreciate it. And you're kind of asking me to go down a long and winding road because this article was kind of a long time coming. You know,
I mean, it reads like you wrote it in a weekend. Like you just kind of like, here's a couple ideas. It does not.
We want to hear the long and winding road.
Okay. All right. So back in 2001, but I entered the field in 2001. And as you folks at ABA Inside Track know, my first job was working with kids who were between 7 and 9 years old who had severe developmental disabilities. Most of them carried a diagnosis of autism. Some were toilet trained, some were not. And eventually I became a BCBA in 2005 and I was supervising some of those same cases, and still some of my clients, and I called them students because I was working at a school, were toilet trained and some of them were not. And then 5 years later, I decided to pursue a PhD in behavior analysis. And I think having at that time 9 years in the field and 5 years as a BCBA working in a really sort of intensive setting, my doctoral education experience was really different from my master's experience because I already knew all this stuff, like all the principles, all the eye-opening, conceptual and practical stuff that makes us all fall in love with behavior analysis and this scientific behavioral perspective where we see, the world through the lens of a contingency. But by the time I was in my doctoral program, I had really seen, to be honest, failures in practice, my own failures, and I didn't understand really why things weren't working. I think it had been so eye-opening and beautiful getting my master's degree. And then when you really get into practice, there's some stuff that doesn't go the way you anticipate. And so that really became the focus of my research in grad school. I wanted to know why, when we had this science that we know, is science. So it's not like you believe it or it's science, and an empirical body of research and like literal experts applying the principles of behavior. Why does it sometimes work? And toilet training was really one of those areas for me. I remember really clearly working with a client, a student of mine she was 10 years old and she'd been attending a day program at our center for like 7 or 8 years and she wasn't toilet trained. And she was spending literally hours each week in the bathroom working through this errorless, research informed toilet training protocol for like 7 years.
I remember that.
Yeah.
I also remember you throwing a little bit of a temper tantrum, being like, why isn't this working?
Because it's supposed to work, right? It's supposed to work. Science. But, part of the issue, I think at the time I thought, well, maybe it's integrity, right? Because she's a day student. And so we're only working on it for some hours each day. And who knows what's happening at home. And I went to her home and her home, it was hard. What was going on in her house was hard. Her parents were, managing all the things that go on when you have a child with severe disabilities 24/7. So, but I still thought maybe this is what it is. And then in the course of my doctoral studies, I had the opportunity to supervise a residential program with kids who were a little bit younger, like ages 5 to 9. And a lot of them were also working on toilet training. So I was like, okay, now I can do this. I will oversee their program for 24 hours a day. They're with trained staff. We can do this. They'll be toilet trained. And, it still didn't go quite as smoothly. Under the advisement of my co-author on this paper, Dr. Amanda Carson, I implemented a treatment package, the LeBlanc and colleagues 2005 package, where they were successful in a pretty quick time period using an intensive protocol. And so I was like all over that and we implemented it and it worked, but it kind of took forever. We got there. I have the data sets, but there are all these kinds of idiosyncratic variables that just function as barriers to success. And then I'm almost done with my long and windy road. Later, I ended up having 3 children, not at the same time, but like within the span of 4 years. And, I've toilet trained all of those children. And we had 3 completely different experiences, even though I was doing essentially the same thing with all of them. Because again, there's all kinds of just extraneous idiosyncratic variables that arise. And they affect the efficacy of what you're trying to do. And so, I worked through them and, always tried to sort of take this conceptually systematic approach. And all of those experiences together, I think, led to this paper. Because Dr. Karsten and I reasoned that if these barriers are occurring in practice, they're probably also arising in research, but they're not the focus of research. And so it's hard to find information about how to resolve. So that's really how we sort of got to this. We did a review of all the behavioral literature on toilet. We worked on it for many years with many iterations. And now you have it.
I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I know one of the questions I had kind of later in talking about your article is it did feel like one of the themes was so many articles on toilet training and almost as if the authors sort of cast off this. And then this weird thing happened and we kind of just did this, but like, whatever, don't worry about it. They all were using the toilet. And it was like, tell me more about that, like how the kid was breaking the toilet seat and how you changed the methodology. That seems relevant. They're like, no, he's peeing. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Look over here now. And it was very strange. I mean, was that just me reading into it? Or was there a sense of there's 8,000 solutions to 8,000 problems, yet they all got kind of glossed over before you sort of brought some of those patterns to light?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably true. I think because when you think about the research question, it's always like, will this package work to train this group of people from this population, right? And so that's really what they're always looking at. But, also as behavior analysts, we're trained to, when we come upon something interesting, to drop everything else and study it, right? And so I think that I think that for the most part, the authors of the many wonderful papers that I reviewed just ignore when things didn't go right. They talked about it a little bit, but it really wasn't the question they were sort of looking at in general. And so it did end up being like this little tiny paragraph, maybe in the results, or like 2 sentences in the discussion. Oh, and by the way, this happened, and here's what we did about it. But it was really kind of hard to find some of that information. And so that's, why we made this paper, because we want to have a resource for people. There are research informed ways to address some of these problems that occur. And we wanted to sort of have a place where they could be collected and shared.
So when you did your research review, you weren't able to just be like, we just looked at the graphs real fast and put them together. Like you had to pore over the articles and say, okay, where did things not go according to kind of our standard toilet training plan? And now we got to dig into that a little more.
Totally.
So there was no cutting corners on writing that. I'm guessing it was just line by line. You got to look through it all.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. You know what? It is amazing when folks do that. Thank you so much. So now we don't have to. We all benefit. We're standing on the shoulders of giants with that. So before we get into the nitty-gritty idiosyncrasies of toilet training, let's take a step back and talk a little bit about just more general pieces of toilet training. Like one thing I liked in the articles that you shared was really thinking a little bit more about how important independence in toilet training can be. When you think about toilet training, are there factors that you think don't get enough kind of credit or taken for granted when it comes to teaching individuals toilet training? Because I think we sort of are like, and continence, hooray, and sort of forgetting some of the other benefits or some of the other things that many of us who just never had a problem toilet training or it's just something we do, I really take for granted for individuals who struggle to learn this skill related to independence. Like, what are kind of the hidden benefits to toilet training that you kind of think?
Oh, hidden. I mean, I think you have such a good point that you say we don't really think about this all the time, but there are so many, I use the term barriers a lot, but there are so many barriers that exist in your life when you're not toilet trained. And I think this is a little bit of an interesting question. I'm going to go on a very small tangent here, but I remember a few years ago, I was, I don't know, looking at some social media group that I'm in, one of the behavior analysis groups, and someone said, I have this problem with my client. They keep having accidents all day in school. And I think that it's because they like the way it feels, because their like pants get really warm for a little while. And I think they like it. And I don't know what to do about it because they like it. And I want to decrease their accidents. And somebody else commented back and said, don't work on that. If they like it, they have a right to have accidents. And, you should just allow that to happen because that's what they're telling you, that they prefer that and they want that. And it took me by surprise a little bit, I think, because I had been so used to always working on trying to toilet train and like resolve accidents and have people not, be sort of at risk for all the things that happen when we don't toilet train children. We know there's an increased risk of abuse when people are not independent at using the toilet. And we know that there's also health and hygiene implications, right? That people can get bacterial infections and all kinds of other health problems. We know that there are social problems that arise when you're having accidents all day long. We know that you can't, enter a public pool, for example, if you're not bowel trained. And so there's so many different things that come up. Your job opportunities are limited. Access to so many places are limited if you either have restricted toileting or no toileting skills. And so, I kind of thought, am I doing the wrong thing here? But I really went back to our ethics code and thought about, we do want to teach our clients self-determination, but also we have a right to make sure that, or they have a right to always be exposed best that we can give them in terms of making sure that they can access healthy lifestyles and have access to different environments and things like that. And so, I think that there's just so many things that people can't do when they're not toilet trained. And so we really should try to do our best to make sure that everybody has access to that and stays healthy and can go to the pool and do all the things that they might want.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up so that we can start our conversation there. I have had a similar conversation with folks when we are talking about ableism within the field and within, potential objectives that we choose for clients or have clients choose with us. And I have had people say to me as well, that seems ableist to focus on toilet training if it's not a focus for the client. But I think just as you're saying, there is a balance here, and I would, and I know you agree, would 100% put being toilet trained in the category of a behavioral cusp. Because once one can, and not, initiation is its own thing, right? But at least voiding in the toilet is a skill that opens up so many other opportunities for reinforcement, settings for reinforcement. It is very, like you were saying, environmentally limiting to not be toilet trained. And it's a skill that's going to allow access to other additional reinforcers, opportunities for reinforcement, and choice within those varying settings that one then has access to. So I think that we do want to always be mindful of choice, self-determination, and ableism within our goal selection. But this is one that we can also think about, what are going to be the additional benefits of it? And is it a skill that would be targeted within sort of the natural course of education for anyone? And it would be, right? And so we also then don't want to be ableist in the sense that we would limit opportunity for that education for our clients based on their own diagnoses.
Totally. Yes. That was so eloquent, Diane. No wonder you're the host of this podcast. But I totally agree. And I think I've learned never to say 100% of the time something is the case, right? Because there's always an exception, but probably 99% of the time, I think this is that it's supported and it's helpful and it will only result in benefits for our clients.
And there are subtle ways to approach it, right? And a lot of, pieces of the decision-making process that need to be taken into consideration as you have done in your paper.
So before we can talk about barriers, let's do kind of a quick review. And this gets, I think, into a lot of the content in the Perez article. Kind of, Maeve, what is the state generally of toilet training for, whether it's for typically developing children, how, what extensions are more or less important for packages for autistic children? What's kind of the baseline of, and if all goes well, this is the way you toilet train?
Oh, see, that's a question, I think, because there's actually sort of surprisingly not a ton of literature on toilet training. We have these sort of original papers that were written in the 70s. And then there was actually, a good amount of literature written in the 70s, produced in the 70s. And then not a lot since then. There's maybe a paper every 4 years that comes out. And in each one, they sort of have this particular setting. They evaluate some components of that original, Fox and Azrin and Fox, 1971, 1973 protocol. So they do that. And, there's always helpful information that comes out of it. But it's hard to sort of say, what's sort of the basic toilet training package. If you want, I think that the Perez and colleagues paper is the most recent published in JABA in terms of evaluating the efficacy of a package. And they actually had a pretty brief protocol, I guess. Their package was pretty straightforward. It was only 3 main components. And, they changed from diapers to underpants. They had a 30-minute sit schedule, and they brought their participants to the bathroom every 30 minutes. And then they prompted them to sit on the toilet for 3 minutes. And then they implemented dry pants checks, and they reinforced, anytime the participants voided in the toilet, anytime they self-initiated a toilet visit, and anytime they were dry at a dry pants check. And so that's pretty, I don't want to say simple, but it was, not really complex or complicated in terms of what they were doing. And they were pretty effective with that. And that was a replication of a package that was published by Greer and colleagues a few years before that. That was for typically developed. And so I think that those probably, if we were going to say, what's the cutting edge research, that probably is it, because it's the most recent package that had showed success, evidence of success.
Which is funny to say cutting edge in that a lot of those techniques have been around for a long time. But I think what was really highlighted in that article is that they were trying to look at what is the least intrusive approach that can be done and get the results that we're looking for. And it was able to eliminate some of the, didn't mean to say that, take out.
I feel like you planned this. She's got a piece of paper, folks. She's looking at it. She's crossing off her.
Take out some
illusions.
of the more intrusive or onerous components of toilet training as set up back in Nazareth and Fox, and still get good results with it. So it's cutting edge in that sense, right?
Right. And that is what a lot of the toilet training research is. There's all these different sort of combinations of these sort of, validated components. They've all always been part of a package, but the packages are presented in different permutations throughout time, and they have slightly different results, usually generally good results. But there's always, one thing that's really, I think, important right now to consider is, they didn't rely on a punishment procedure, which has always been a big component of toilet training. And, again, our ethical guidelines compel us to use reinforcement-based procedures whenever possible before moving to punishment. And so, I think that that's a really important piece of this paper. Also, they demonstrated that success without the punishment component.
So, Maeve, you and Dr. Carson sort of referred to, I think, kind of like that general package or those general components as behavior analytic toilet training or BAT. Was that a term that had been used prior or was used in other articles, or you were like, we got to come up with something because you were calling it something else and it was taking too many lines, and so you had to acronymize it?
Yeah, well, we came up with that term. I'm not sure, I feel like maybe there was some resistance to that term from different groups of people that we ran it by in the past, but I think that it's the most descriptive term for what we were trying to express. Because I think in the past, it's often been called rapid toilet training. And like anyone who's done it in practice knows that it's not a rapid process. It's just not. It's just, so that seemed like a misnomer. And maybe more rapid than like never toilet training, but like it takes a while. And it's varied. I mean, like even within, a lot of the research, you'll see a huge amount of range in the duration. So, we didn't think that was a great description. And, there were some other different names of it, but really, these are behavior analysts who developed this, and it's based on the principles of behavior. And so we really thought that it was fitting to call it behavior analytic toilet training.
I like the term. I just wasn't. Anytime I see an acronym, there's always a part of me that's like, oh no, everyone's been using this acronym, but me for years. Where did it come from?
That's true too, Rob. Everyone's been using it.
Oh no.
No, it was coined with this paper. I don't know if it will take off, but I like I said, I think that it's, we did that on purpose to sort of differentiate it from the discussions of child-led versus parent-led and rapid versus non-rapid, and really just trying to be very concise about what we were talking about.
It's so helpful.
As scared as I am to be left out of an acronym, you can bet that the next time, if I'm talking to anyone who's talking about toilet training, I'll say, have you tried BAT procedures? I've been using this term for years. It's very well established, and I'm in the know.
I can say when I was working as a behavior analyst doing toilet training, and someone's like, have you tried the rapid method? I'm like, yeah. for like 5 months I've been doing the rapid method, right? Like,
Right.
Yeah,
We
rapid must
get
be
there.
relative.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's relative. It's not like your whole
Right.
lifetime, but
Well, the book is like toilet training in less than a day. So it sets you up to think that it might be rapid, but
Mhm.
generally not,
Super
because
not
there end up being a lot of other contributing factors to
Totally.
whether that skill is picked up quickly or not. And many times you end up, needing to address what those additional factors.
Was it a quantifiable less than a day, or was it like, it could take anywhere from like less than a day to 7 months? And, the copy editor's like, no, less than a day. That's the one that sells. Toilet training
I
from
do
1
not
to
know.
many years. It's just no one's buying that book.
To give them credit, I did use this protocol with with all of my children. And with one of them, it did take less than a day, but only with one of them. So
Mhm.
sometimes it could take less than a day.
was it your
Some-
third?
No.
Oh.
My first. I actually told myself, don't talk about any of their training experiences in an identifying way before you go on this
Sorry.
podcast. And I just did.
Sorry, that was my fault.
That's okay.
So everyone, if you were out and you're hanging out and you're hearing someone talk about like, the toilet training less than a day totally worked for me. It must be one of Maeve's kid, right? I'm sure there's other people who good success. I
Yeah.
don't even remember how we toilet trained our kids
It
at this
did not
point.
take a day.
It didn't take a day. Various
Yeah.
points of it did. Some things did. Some things took forever.
Right.
So, okay. So we've got these procedures, and Perez et al., kind of review the pieces that seem to be the key components. And maybe you mentioned those, the underwear, the differential reinforcement, the bathroom visits. So, in doing your review, and I'm not going to pretend like Diana, I didn't write this down, because I did. I wrote this one down, folks. Where did you find that BAT procedures tend to crap out?
Oh.
I mean, that's a good question.
Thank you.
I think the thing is that this paper wasn't a component review, and so it's hard to sort of answer that question. But we did end up finding 22 studies that met our criteria, and we grouped them by barrier categories that we titled. And, 16 of the studies had multiple barriers sort of arise for the different participants in the studies. And, I think that they all had, I think that probably the most common problems were ongoing accidents despite experiences with positive reinforcement for elimination in the toilet. Okay, that was one big problem. And then the other problem that we saw a lot of was withholding urination during training. So, kids would sit on the toilet and nothing would come out. And then maybe 5 minutes later they would go, or maybe they wouldn't go all day long. Okay. So
Mhm.
I also had that as a personal experience with one of my children happen. So those are seeming like the two biggest areas of concern. They weren't always addressed. Not every single barrier was addressed in every single study, but those were the things that we saw sort of happening the most.
Oh, so I did kind of jump ahead a little bit, because I do kind of want to go back and talk a little just about how you generally, so you grouped your barriers and you grouped the solutions. Did you have sort of a flow system or a way you were working to kind of keep all of the different little modifications in line? Because I know, like, in reading it, it was very well, it just felt so thorough, but you definitely had articles in which one barrier for one participant was mentioned in one section of your article, and then that same study was mentioned later for a separate problem. I mean, that must have been a nightmare to keep track of all the different issues that came up and then being able to clump them together in those barriers. Like, was there anything in terms of folks who are looking into doing with toileting, but similar research in terms of looking at barriers? Any tips you have to sort of keep yourself from just circling around with the same problem, the same articles, going back and forth and back and forth?
A really good question. I think we, spent a lot of time trying to figure out the organization of this information, because some of them are really dense. And like sometimes, like the Hagopian and colleagues 1993 paper about water prompting, there's like 3 barriers and it's a brief report. So they address everything, but there's 3 big problems that happen in that paper. And that happens kind of a lot, that there's sort of like a cluster of issues. And so what we really tried to do is think about this in the order that it would arise in a clinical case. Like, what kinds of problems or barriers would you encounter as you sat down and said, I'm going to toilet train this person? Remember, I'm like a clinician first. And so That's how I thought about this paper. When we first, before we even get into the bathroom, there's problem behavior occurring. So we thought about that. And then, okay, let's say we can get them into the bathroom. We can start toilet training. What happens if they don't go at all when we sit them on the toilet? And then, what happens? Get them to go on the toilet and everything's going well. And they're contacting all the reinforcement for doing what we want them to do. And then they don't stop having accidents. And so we kind of thought about like, when are these problems going to arise as you're sort of approaching a clinical pace? And that's how we organized it. And then just really sort of being counting where they occurred when and looking at the different strategies that the researchers used to sort of surmount all the barriers. So I should say that these barrier categories, we came up with the categories. They were not named like this in the article. So if you're like, oh, let me just look up this article and see what they did about recurrent accidents. Well, the article authors didn't call it recurrent accidents, but what we did is we had a criteria for what looked like ongoing accidents after positive reinforcement, after success was occurring, and then they were still having ongoing accidents. And then we sort of grouped the article.
It certainly reads like, it reads like two authors who read almost every, if not every toilet training article and like really thought through how does all of this information go into a paper that one can read. And then, like you said, kind of follow that chain of events or sort of look at like, that's not the problem I'm having. Oh, here's the one I'm having. Here's some ideas I'm going to pull from this rather than digging through everything and praying that you find someone with the same problem. The only thing I was wondering is, do you ever think like a flow chart, or was it really appropriate given it was just like 8,000 branches of problems? Like if this, then here's 70 things that could go wrong. And here, like it might be too busy to do as a flow chart.
No, I think that's a great question. And that is, at one point there was a flow chart in this paper. And, aside from the fact that I just couldn't stop laughing, but I think that what we ultimately sort of concluded is that there isn't enough research to support like a decision-making model, right? That we couldn't really say, okay, if this happens, then do this, because maybe there was one study where they did one thing and they didn't have IOA. Or maybe there's one study where they did one thing and they described it and they graphed it, but they didn't do any sort of experimental control about that one thing. And maybe they did. Sometimes they did, or sometimes there's, multiple participants where they replicated the same strategy to surmount the same barrier. Like there's a consecutive case series analysis by Lomas Meevers and colleagues that does a really nice job. They had, I think, like 44 participants and went through and, so sometimes you could find evidence of that, but not all the time. And so we just didn't feel like there was enough to sort of say like, here's how you do it. But what we wanted to say was like, here are some resources that you can use. We're working our way towards developing an evidence-based practice for how to proceed with toilet training. And we don't quite have everything we need to state definitively what will work.
That makes perfect sense. The difference between why you have that versus, here are some ideas and here's what has worked and why it might work. I was just going to say, this is an area that definitely we have more clinical expertise in than is probably reflected in our research practices, because I don't think that many people have, really devoted their research to toileting. It's kind of surprising, right? So you hear everyone saying, oh, try this, this worked for me, that worked for me. But like you're saying, we may have little evidence of that in the research body to really say with, definitiveness, I guess, that this is an effective strategy, or really what the generality of that type of strategy may be. So even though this is something that as a clinician, if you're working with this population, you are absolutely going to encounter times where you are working on toilet training, there's not that much research comparatively to look toward. Yeah. So people need to be doing more research in order to back up or, further define what our successful practices are so that we can keep building that decision tree, like you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that, this is a place where clinicians can really make a big contribution.
Yes.
And, folks who are conducting research and have access to clinical populations, this is another, we don't necessarily know what are the most common barriers. We don't know how often they occur. We don't know if there's more than what we sort of detected in the literature. We think there probably are, but we don't really know. And so I think that, this was a way to sort of collect these these practices. And I don't want to make it sound like, oh, well, they don't have IOA or they haven't been really validated, because they all are based in this sort of conceptually systematic model, right? That's about like shaping and fading and things that we know work in different areas, and we understand how they work. We understand stimulus control. And that's really what's happening in these studies, is that they're pulling these, different ways of applying the principles that have been validated in so many different scenarios for so many different behaviors and using them in toilet training settings. That, I feel confident saying that like they probably will work, but we just don't have that body of evidence in our published literature to say that, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
Hey everyone, sorry to pause our conversation with Dr. Donnelly, but I wanted to remind all our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QAVA approved. By listening, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or click the link in your podcast player to go directly to the appropriate location to enter in some key information about yourself, as well as 2 secret code words we've hidden in the episode. And these are special guest code words. The first one is PANDA, P-A-N-D-A. Now, you might think it is the big raccoon-like bear from China, but it is actually a reference to one of Dr. Donnelly's hamsters. I don't know if the hamster is colored like a panda. I would guess so. We didn't actually talk about it. It was just the code word, and we go with our guest code words. PANDA. All right, back to the show. All right, well, let's look at the kind of the 4 main barriers that kind of got headings in the article and talk about some of the different solutions that came up. And
let's give the people what they want to hear.
I know. So I just put them in the note. I'm just going to read them out kind of I think the order they were presented in the article. So one of the kind of more common barriers that was noted were problem behaviors occurring in the context of toilet training, which is always one that I'm surprised you don't see more of, because this idea of, hey, how would you like every 30 minutes to stop what you're doing, walk to the bathroom, the most exciting place that ever there was, and sit there for 3 minutes. And if you pee, something good will happen after that. I'm surprised that isn't a barrier for every child. Like, this is the worst thing. Like, why do I have to go to this space? So what were some of the kind of barriers and possible solutions that you found looking at this, or that you saw reported?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was common, and this is something that I think a lot of people have, a history with in practice, different problem behavior occurring in the bathroom, whether it's, flopping or bolting away from the toileting area, or aggression or destruction of the bathroom area. There's all kinds of different things that can happen in the bathroom. And it's also like a wet environment,
Yes.
with like tile floors, and there's all kinds of like things that can happen in the bathroom that I don't have to go into super graphic detail over. But I think that's a common barrier, and additional behavior that's just sort of like interfering with toilet training. Like I've worked with students and clients who engage in like excessive flushing, or they've you try to sort of fade your presence out so they can be more independent, and then all the toilet paper goes down the toilet, or it doesn't go down, it just clogs the toilet, I should say. So all kinds of like interfering problematic behavior can occur. And so, the first sort of solution or set of solutions that we explored was just sort of modifying or eliminating any potentially aversive treatment components. Okay. So what would we be doing as the therapists or the interventionists or the clinicians, whoever is implementing the toilet training, and how could we change some of our procedures? And that's where we're really, some of the earlier literature really did have a big emphasis on punishment procedures. And I think that that's, trying to decrease accidents. So of course, like punishment is a component, a way to decrease behavior. But, there are lots of ways that they can be modified to either be shortened, like positive practice could be really greatly abbreviated. And that was demonstrated in research. Or, some kind of supplementary stimuli could be added. Like if you had an extended duration toilet sit, for example, that could be shortened. Or you could give somebody something to look at or do while they're sitting on the toilet for a long period of time. Okay. So those are two sort of examples of treatment components that could be potentially aversive.
The general population has mastered that one.
Right.
Having something to look at.
Oh,
right.
yeah.
Right.
Give all the kids one of those big bathroom readers when they go. They'll love it. There's so many fun factoids about Tarzan movies or whatever those things all are about.
Yeah.
Well, you were talking earlier about, I think you mentioned the destruction of the toilet lid, right? Mm-hmm. And that there is a study, Dowdy and colleagues, or I think there's one colleague, Dowdy, at least is the first author. And, that was the problem behavior was just every time the client would go into the bathroom, they would destroy the toilet lid. And so they just gave the client an iPhone or some kind of cell phone, smartphone, and they used it. And that ended the destruction because they had something else to do.
They didn't want to check. Maybe it was one of those cold lids, like the one of those soft lids that like your grandma would have on her toilet, maybe a more comfortable lid.
Yeah, something like that, right? So there's all kinds of like practical things you can do to make the toileting environment less aversive. You can also just sort of eliminate. This is something great that we've found in research that a lot of times you can eliminate those aversive components. You don't need to have a long extended duration toilet sit. You don't need to implement positive. There is evidence in research that you can implement a successful toilet training intervention and not have those components at all. And so that's nice to see and something to try. There was another situation where there was a client they had all this restitutional overcorrection where they're doing all this extra washing of their clothing and whatever. And then they were engaging in sexualized behavior because they were spending so much time washing their body after they toilet trained. And the authors just said, okay, let's not do that anymore. And then they were able to actually implement the protocol and the client was able to contact reinforcers for the targeted behavior and, things went on. And I'm saying these very sort of like, and then this happened. It was a perfect solution. Of course, more goes into it than that, but those are some of the strategies that they use. So providing non-contingent access to items, also there's some documentation of conducting functional assessment for problem behavior, right? Because that's our best practice for problem behavior is to assess, determine the function, develop a function-based treatment. And so there's some evidence of that in the literature also. That's something that, certainly behavior analysts are trained to do and can go ahead and do that.
I appreciate that. I believe it might have been the discussion or else it was in that section, sort of looking at how much information has probably already been gathered around toileting behavior. The idea that, when you're thinking about functional analysis in that context, you may be able to just use the data you already collected or use all the observations you've been doing. Because when I see like you could do a functional analysis of problem behaviors in the bathroom, it just feels like that is an extra wrinkle in my functional analysis procedure. I do not want to deal with it. And now I'm in the bathroom all day. So just being
and it's not a safe place.
No, it is not a safe place to be
occurring. Right. Yeah.
Like surfaces are hard, slippery. Yeah. So, I think that most of the time, like you just said, you can look and see what's happening. Oh, it seems like they're, every time we stand in front of the toilet paper dispenser, they are hitting us. Maybe I could just move the toilet dispenser out of the way or, something like that. Usually you can come up with a simple solution just by conducting a very basic observation type assessment.
All right. Another barrier was excessive urine retention.
Right. So that's what we called it when the participants in the studies were going to the bathroom when they were sort of supposed to be doing that, whether it was during the whole treatment session or, during the daytime and they were going at night instead or something like that. And this is another place where I think that sort of our training and our understanding of the principles of behavior plays in, right? The most sort of researched solutions to this barrier were to use shaping and fading procedures. So sometimes you might need to shape like daytime urination, okay, for clients that were only urinating overnight. And you just do that by reinforcing, production, wet diapers. And then you reinforce wet diapers at certain times of day. And then when the client is seated in a chair, and you keep doing that and use that shaping, and then eventually fade away the presence of the diaper and, shape sitting on the toilet, all those kinds of things that we know how to do. We know how to do shaping and fading. Diaper fading by physically cutting away the diaper has been proposed and used in different settings. There is discussions and different attempts to increase the duration of cotton void. So if you've ever had a client that just sits in the toilet and goes like a drop and then gets up and goes, starts to walk away and then has an accident, if they have to go, you want them to go totally in the toilet. So there are some strategies explored there, like differentially reinforcing longer voids or waiting. Even there's one study where they noticed that as soon as the client started to go, they would have like the potty party and deliver the reinforcer right away. And that was sort of interrupting the flow. And so that have an accident later.
Yeah.
And so
I've had that scare kids where you're like,
something simple is just like waiting till they're fully done before you deliver the reinforcer is like a very simple manipulation that might really make a big difference. Water prompting is another one. What else? Negative. Pardon me?
Which one was water prompting? The drinking of water, or was it the use?
Turning on the water.
Oh, turning on the water.
Turning
Okay.
on the water,
Water prompting is when you
pour the
very
water.
slowly, you can elicit urination. This is a Hagopian paper from 1993. You can elicit urination by slowly pouring lukewarm water over the client's sort of genital area. That can elicit urination. And so that's another thing you can try. You probably, want to make sure you're getting informed consent before you do something that intrusive, but that was explored in research and a solution for clients who won't urinate on the toilet.
Yeah.
That would be far down the decision tree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that was just a mean sleepover trick you did to your least liked friends.
Maeve's just shaking her head. She has no response to that.
I'm not going to
that's the
sleep over
basis
your
in
house,
science.
you guys. Okay. Negative reinforcement contingency is another thing that you can make use of, right? So if you have a client who's not, going to the bathroom when during their time, if they're sitting on the toilet, you've scheduled them to get there, they're there. Maybe they don't like being on the toilet and it would be a reinforcer to leave the toilet. And so, you can set up a contingency where if they go quickly, they can leave the toilet, even if their sort of prescribed duration of their sit is not over yet.
That seems to make sense to me. I think I've never made anyone sit past the time that they voided. But good to have it in writing.
Yes, it's right. So it counts.
Yeah.
It's been published.
Yes.
And the other things are just, providing more opportunities to contact positive reinforcers for going, right? So making scheduled sits likely to occur when urination is, when the MO is strong. So like at the end of a school day, for example, if they haven't gone all day, or providing scheduled sits during a time when you see lots of accidents. So it's likely that they're going to go, and then you can, have the behavior contact that reinforcement. So those are some of the strategies that were explored in research for resolving accidents, excessive urine retention.
So excessive urine retention, recurrent accidents kind of had a lot of the same solutions, or were there some additional ones when it was more just about the accidents or having accidents?
Yeah, I think that when it was about accidents, we saw a lot of strategies related to making the consequences for the accidents more salient. So, this is when people would bring positive practice in if they hadn't used it as part of their initial package. That's probably one of the bigger ones that we saw for that. Another thing, again, though, a change to the toileting schedule, making it more dense. That is very similar to what we talked about as a possible solution for excessive retention also.
Mm-hmm. And then problems with self-initiation, which again, you technically can be continent without being able to self-initiate. Certainly for many clients, that's a goal of theirs. It's a goal of parents, it's other stakeholders to be able to say, I'm going to use the bathroom. I'm choosing to go to the bathroom.
Yeah. And I think that there were kind of two categories of problems with self-initiation. There were either not enough initiation. So like clients were never initiating or doing it at a very low rate. And I'm saying clients, but I should say participants, about studies here. or they were excessive. They were happening and they didn't necessarily correlate with the actual, condition of having to go to the bathroom. And so there were a few different strategies explored. There's a study where they taught the participant to respond to supplemental cues, like the time on a wrist. There's another sort of strategy that was explored that involved just discontinuing prompts to toilet, just to make sure that sorry, my watch just talked to me, just explain what time it is.
I was like, what time is it, Maeve?
So that's funny because I just realized I was tapping my watch when I was talking about supplemental cues. So, I think that I lost my train of thought when I was just talking about watch. But, the different strategies have to do with just making sure that, again, that, that you're not sort of over prompting the client to use the toilet, that they have the opportunity to ask for the toilet, that they both are going to need to go and that they can ask for it before they're scheduled prompted to do it.
Yeah. To me, these are all about misplaced EOs, right? Or lack of EO, because sure, you ask for the bathroom, you get to get up, you get to leave whatever other thing it was that you're working on. And as long as you produce a little bit, you also are going to probably get something preferred as well, right? So it can become a nice reinforcement opportunity as well as a negative reinforcement opportunity away from whatever other thing you were currently working on that maybe was hard or tricky.
Yes.
But it has nothing to do with actually needing to go to the bathroom. And then, so you have to kind of correct for that. And then the other piece that can happen is particularly if you've had a client on a really dense schedule of trips and they've learned to produce a little bit each time. Because again, you want to, if you're there, that's what my grandma always says, right? If you go, if the opportunity presents itself, you go, because you never know when the next one's coming. So, you learn, you go every time. But in doing so, that own biological EO of actually needing to go to the bathroom and experiencing that type of negative reinforcement never really gets at strength because you produce a little bit each time, right? So, I mean, obviously it says it in your paper, right? But like leaning out that schedule then can allow that naturally occurring EO to emerge and thereby increase self-initiation. So this one is all about the EO to me.
Yes, totally.
So, Maeve, I think, and certainly folks, if you like just some of these lists, Maeve goes into a lot more detail in the full article. So this is just, a good kind of review of a lot of the content that's in there. But I had a couple questions that they were sort of mentioned or discussed a little bit in the article, but I'd love to hear, more of your thoughts on them. One sort of being, did you find as you were sort of going through all of these barriers, all of these potential solutions, that there were variables that we might want to start taking data on, preemptively or be thinking about ahead of time just in case? Or is it really a matter of like, well, you could take data on something, like latency to urination, or you could take data on, patterns of like behaviors that are precursors to needing to urinate, but you don't really need that data until there's a problem? Or were there ones that you're like, from now on, I'm going to take data on this factor just in case, because if there's a problem, this is the one I'm going to be looking at. This is the information I'm going to want to use.
Yeah. So I think that is another good question because, everybody, how should I say this? We have all these, everybody goes to the bathroom the same way, right? The same sort of physiological things happen. And really our job when we're teaching people to be toilet trained is to teach them to respond to these like physiological stimuli that are occurring that we can't see directly, but we know they're happening, and we can make them more likely by ensuring that the client has access to fluids and, not too many fluids that they're going to overflow, but enough that they're going to have to go and that they're going to sort of feel that internal pressure. And then, it's all about the timing and making sure that they have the opportunity to use the toilet and that the reinforcers are there so they can contact those reinforcers, right? So, I think that sort of physiological understanding is really important. And I think that if you are planning to sort of toilet train a child and they've never had any problems with toilet training, this is sort of the first time you're doing it, you probably can just like start fresh. You can probably just take those, components that were in the Perez paper, for example, and that's just an example, but something like that, and just go ahead and do it. And you don't really need a ton of extra information. But as soon as you start to see that progress isn't being made. And I would say like within that couple days, like don't wait a month or two and say, we really can't get the hang of toilet training. Like if you start to notice that, then you do have to do sort of an analysis of what the problem is. And that's when you're going to start collecting data on, for example, they're never going. Well, what time are they? I mean, they must be going at some point, right? So what time of day are they going? That's when you sort of be able to make a decision about what data to collect. Because I'm kind of a big fan of not collecting data that you're not going to use. It is a burden on staff.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because you got to bring that clipboard into the bathroom over and over. Like that's not a clean clipboard. You don't want to be touching that.
Yeah. So I would say like you don't necessarily have to do that unless you start to notice problems. And problems, I would say like within a day or two, if there's no progress being made, then that's when you start to say, okay, let me figure out what is here.
And then it would just be specific to the patterns of toileting, any other problems that you're like, is this a problem? Do you take data on it, see if it really is or is not?
I think so. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if these are exactly dissemination station questions, but they're not all targeted in the article. So maybe we should move into dissemination station. But then you get a lot of dissemination station questions made. Special treat. I'm sure you're excited. What a relieving sound.
Sounds of the dissemination train.
So Maeve, this article was definitely written for clinicians to look at the procedure. And
in the true spirit of BAP, let me just say as well.
Yes.
Right.
News you can use. I guess, where do you see, or is this sort of a follow-up, or the jury is still totally out? Where do you see parents and caregivers coming into the process? I mean, is it the sort of thing of, if you are reading this paper because all these problems are happening, consult a professional, or are there some of these components that should go into the updated, the toilet training in more than a day book that might need to come out, for parents and caregivers to use?
Yeah. I mean, I think that absolutely parents can toilet train children. Of course they can do that. And we, as, in our behavior analytic literature, we have, staff training research that corresponds to parent training research. And so there's lots of different ways that we know that we can support parent acquisition of these kinds of protocols and things like that. And especially when we start with this sort of less intrusive, less intensive model. But I also think that it's really important, if you have a contact with a family that is working on this and you are their clinician, that you are in contact with them, that it's not like a set it and forget it kind of situation, because a lot of these studies also brought back or, described in their participant characteristics that there were situations where like this training had been tried in the past, but it didn't work. So parents stopped doing it. There are a number of studies that was noted. And really, like, there's not, in my mind, unless there's some greater health and safety risk than having ongoing accidents, which, like I said, there always could be, but unless there's some greater one, there's not really a reason to stop toilet training. It's more about refining. And that really is where behavior analysts are skilled. Is that we're going to be able to say, okay, you know what? I understand that this long duration toilet sit is not working for your child and you don't want to implement it. And they're like, ripping the toilet paper dispenser off the wall and you don't like that either. And I get it. So let's come up with a different strategy that's going to allow them to sort of get in touch with those reinforcers for, the behavior that we want to see. And I think that perspective is really important. So I think that, parents and caregivers, yes, they can do it, but it is important that if you're sort of providing ongoing consult or check-ins or something like that, so that when they decide, okay, I'm not going to do this part, that, if it's a critical part, that you give them a different way to implement that piece that's going to work for them. Or you come up with some other that's going to work.
I think that kind of leads into my next question too, in that, are there areas related to toilet training as, behavior analytic clinicians that you would say, if you don't have X background or know about this, component of behavior change, you might be falling outside of, I don't want to say exactly competence in toilet training, but perhaps you're not going to be as effective in toilet training? Because I always have a hard time with procedures like toilet training in terms of wondering like, well, of course that's in my area of competence. There's a book that anyone can buy that goes over most of the key components. And then everything else that's all conceptually systematic. That's all task list stuff in the context of I'm in the bathroom doing it. But I might be being too glib in that idea. I mean, are there areas of, if you haven't done XYZ or you haven't read up on ABC, you're not going to be successful. Maybe you're not being, out of competence, but you're really hitting that sweet spot of competence, confidence that you should be in.
Yeah. So I think maybe there's like three-ish areas. I mentioned earlier about like physiological stimuli. I think that I'm not like advocating for anyone to go to medical school or become a urologist, but I think it's helpful to have like a basic understanding of how the bladder works in the body. Because that's going to help you sort of maintain all the different physiological, setting that you need to have. You need to know, how much liquid should a client have and how much is too much and about how often should they go and those kinds of things. You should know that stuff in a very basic level. Like I looked at like the Johns Hopkins University website to figure it out. And I think that that's great. And then also you're going to be working a lot of the time with families and caregivers. And so you should brush up on your listening skills and make sure that you are collaborating with them. And so that's another piece that's just always going to be primary. And if you're not really good at that and you're just sort of thinking about the protocol that's in the book that you want them to implement, I think that you're going to have a harder time and they're going to have a harder time and they might not be successful. But then from like a technical perspective, stimulus control, your understanding of stimulus control is going to be critical because you are, again, sort of teaching someone how to respond to stimuli. And so you have to sort of understand how to facilitate that and understand how, you have to have experiences with responding in the presence of the S plus and the S minus and making sure that all of those, the SD and I'm getting nervous being on the show. I'm using my terms all mixed up. But you have to sort of be aware of how stimulus control works, how to establish it, because that's ultimately what is going to happen is that the toilet should become an SD for urination. And so should that feeling, that physiological pressure feeling.
So Maeve, I know it might be a couple of years based on the pattern so far before anyone publishes another toilet training article. Although we don't know, when was Perez? That was
2020.
Oh, that was, I was going to say, I thought that was 2023. No, it's okay. So might be a few years, but kind of what's the next big question for toilet training research? Maybe it could be less than 2 or 3 years. Like what is the kind of the answer that either whether you want to look for it or whether you're hoping somebody else is looking at this now, but kind of what's the next like big research article that you want to see for toilet training?
Yeah. Okay. That's a good question. I think there's two probably big things one is that we should really have a better understanding of what components are necessary because we don't really know that. Because like I said, we have a lot of validations of different combinations of components, but we don't know exactly what's sort of like that flow chart that you talked about earlier. What's going to be the best thing to do when. And then the other thing is, when it comes to thinking about individual components, they've all been explored and validated in lots of different ways and also used in practice. But I think that self-initiations kind of took me by surprise because I think that something that was very interesting is that there wasn't really a consistent definition or expectation for what a self-initiation is. And a lot of studies measure self-initiations, which is important, right? Independence is important. But some studies define self-initiations as, the client walking by the bathroom and going in without telling anybody. And some defined it as manned and some defined it as, following the schedule and then going or, so there's so many different ways we talk about it, but it doesn't mean the same thing. And so I think we need to come up with like, what is that sort of the lingo for describing like a self-initiation that the client just not out of the blue, but, under the presence of certain stimuli engages in that initiation response. And what does it look like when it's prompted? And, all the different ways that it could happen. We need to be more precise about how we just.
Hey.
That's great. I am curious if there are particular profiles of clients that indicate success with the toileting plan or what that plan may look like. And does it vary based on potential like readiness components that we might see for a client?
So I think that this is another thing where it's more sort of anecdotal. I think as behavior analysts, we're trained to think about readiness And development really is like a point in a series of experiences, right? Not necessarily correlated with a particular age.
Yeah.
And, when it comes to readiness for toilet training, I think about things like, not so much like, are they sort of psychologically ready to toilet train, which is, I think, what our greater culture looks at, but more so like, does the client have the skills to independently toilet themselves? Like, can they get to the toilet? Can they sit on the toilet independently without falling off? Can they pull their pants up and down? They follow some basic directions. They don't have to do all these things, but you're going to have a better, easier time training them if they can do all of these things. So think about those skills that are really related to the act of toileting and make sure that those are trained up first.
Great.
Well, Dr. Maeve Donnelly, thank you so much for writing this article, for taking the time to talk with us about it and revisiting the concept of toilet training. So, we another 200 and something episodes before we'll need another one of these. You answered all the questions. We just sat here and listened and said, "Oh, that sounds good to us." If folks do come up with another question in the meantime, or they're reading through the article and they're wondering about a piece of it that we didn't cover, is there a way that they can get in touch with you?
Absolutely. I love to field questions. I think my contact information is in the article, but you can also contact me at ma.donnelly. Is this what you're asking me to do? Give my email or something?
The plug section. If we were movie stars, this would be the plug section of the show.
So it's M as in Mary, a.donnelly, DONNELLY @northeastern.edu.
And is there anything else? I think we were talking a little bit before we started. Anything else that you want to share is coming up in the future?
Yeah, I think, there's always a lot of things going on. That one of the things that I'm excited about right now is I'm working on developing some brochures for pediatricians' offices and also a website to help parents with toilet training and other childhood concerns. And that is sort of on the forefront of my efforts these days. And, I'll be talking about that at ABAI this year. So hopefully if people want to connect about that or other projects or toilet training, I'm happy to do that. So
that's super cool.
That's very
needed.
Cool.
Yeah.
Once again, we want to say a big thanks to Dr. Maeve Donnelly for coming on the show and talking to us all about toilet training and the idiosyncrasies in toilet training procedures. But before we finally wrap up the show, we want to go to the last section, pairings. Diana, tell us about pairings.
Hello, and welcome to the segment of the show called Pairings. Pairings is when I tell you about other episodes from our back catalog that you might want to check out if you enjoyed this one. So we had an episode devoted to toilet training all the way back in episode 8. So you can go revisit that if you like to and hear some past research on toilet training. I also threw in episode 34, which is actually on preschool life skills, but it's working with the same population age group, most likely. And also we have episode 34 and episode 95, which revisits preschool life skills, one with just a typical preschool population and one with a population with disabilities. In the same vein, I think toilet training research kind of bridges that gap as well. So I wanted to highlight those for that reason. Episode 191, where we discussed behavioral cusps, and we led this episode talking about how toilet training or being toilet trained is likely a cusp. And then finally, episode 236, where we discuss assent and self-determination with Dr. Haley Steinhauser and Alex Kishbaugh. Again, that was part of our intro subject matter for this episode as well. I also like to recommend a snack for you to enjoy while you listen to these episodes. Our snack today is goldfish.
Goldfish.
Yes. And we actually didn't talk about this but it's in the list of remedial strategies that one can take, and is throwing using a target in the toilet. Right. And I had always used goldfish as the target. So you throw a couple goldfish in there, you can aim for them, try to sink the goldfish.
Gotcha.
But, they're a delicious snack as well. So goldfish. And then also just, a big old jug of water to wash those goldfish down and maybe help to establish the EO for going potty.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. And please enjoy.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Diana. All right. Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode of ABA Inside Track. If you did, why not give us a subscribe on your podcast player? You can also find us on all the social medias as ABA Inside Track. You can follow us there. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, for links to the articles discussed on this episode, as well as links to all of the episodes that we've previously done. If you want even more ABA Inside Track, including access to our episodes a week ahead of time, discounts on CEs, and access to our special listener only or patron only episodes that we do every season, go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can join there. You can vote on listener choice and book club episodes. And for subscribing, you can also get those CEs that go with those episodes for no additional cost as a thank you to us. So that's, boy, oh boy, that's going to be...
Thank you from us.
Thank you from us to you. That's going to be, man, that's 2, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 CEs a year just for subscribing. Patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. You've kind of done the math before now. I must have at one point.
When there's all the book clubs.
Yeah, the book club, the listener's choice episodes, all that good stuff. And also you can always email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Some final thanks. Certainly another thank you to Dr. Maeve Donnelly. A thank you to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, to Kyle Sturry for his interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. Oh, and I almost forgot, our last special secret code word is football. FOOTBALL. You might think it is the oblong shaped ball that's tossed around, at least if you're playing American football.
I was going to say.
But no, this is a reference also from Dr. Donnelly to her other hamster, football. We'll be back.
It is in memory of football.
In memoriam to
Yes.
poor football, unfortunately. Yes. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye!